Everyone, and welcome back to the Tools for Perseverance. This is Dr. Jessica Wright. Today is our second part of trauma skills, the three-part series where we're going to be discussing trauma, what it is, and how we can recognize it and what we can do about it. So first I want to start by reminding us what trauma is. So trauma is an emotional response to an event or a series of events that creates fear, a sense of fear in us, or a sense of unpredictability, like we can't predict the future. And all of this leads us to feel like our life is under threat, right? That is the definition of trauma. And remember, last time we talked about how life being under threat doesn't mean that we think we might die, although it can mean that we think we might die. It also means that we might lose our sense of security, that we might life can also include losing your job, or it can include losing the house that you live in, or it can include losing a long-held belief that you have about how the world works. And we discussed also about how different psychologists have identified that what we experienced during COVID may hit many of these criteria. So today we're going to be talking about how do you recognize when you are experiencing trauma versus when you're experiencing the stress of like a stress being a lower level problem, right? So all of us are under stress. How do you know when it's elevated to the point of you experiencing trauma where you need to do something about it? You need to get that help that you need. The last thing I want to say before we move on to how we identify trauma is, remember, we do not control our emotions, right? They are produced in an unconscious part of our brains. The emotions are signals to us, and so we're not controlling the source of the emotion. We do control our reaction to it. So when we talk about having an emotional response to an event, one of the key components that we heard from the head of the National Mental Health Illness Association, he described how this is not a lack of character or your lack of strength to handle a situation. That has nothing to do with that. It has to do how we're biologically wired, factors that are out of our control, whether or not you experience trauma. Now, your response to trauma can be one of strength, right? Your response to trauma can be one that leads you to healing and recovering. But whether or not you experience trauma is not up to you. So, let's talk about how we identify trauma versus stress. So, and that's really what it comes down to. We've talked a little bit about in emotional intelligence when we talked about doorbells and we talked about red flag behaviors. Here's how we know it's time to reach out to get help. And hopefully most people are recognizing during these unprecedented times, reaching out, getting help, talking to a therapist, talking to a friend, talking to a spiritual or a faith advisor is going to be incredibly valuable to all of us to make it through times of uncertainty, which we are currently living in. All right, so let's talk about trauma versus stress. So here is... we talked about stress being something you can recognize by those doorbells. Maybe you feel your shoulders are clenched. Maybe you feel like your jaw is sore because you have been clenching your teeth. Maybe you've been holding your breath. Maybe your posture is different, right? Those are signs that you're experiencing stress or anxiety and that needs to be dissipated. Well, how do you know if you're experiencing trauma? Well, one of the first ways is if you find yourself obsessing over the news, over information about what's going on, and you're repeatedly thinking about the negative, right? When you are watching the news, you're not just doing it to get information, to better understand the situation that we're all in. You're really doing deep dives into some of the negative and more terrible things that happen, right? I have the little picture of a puppy watching the television because it's sort of like you're glued to the screen, you're glued to the news, you have a hard time looking away. That might be an indicator, one of those doorbells that alerts you to you might be experiencing trauma, right? Because obsessing would be a natural response to it. Okay, so another way, another doorbell, another thing that might indicate that you're experiencing trauma versus just the regular stress of it is you're having extreme trouble with sleep. This is not just a single night of tossing and turning or worrying about things. This is if you are sleeping far more than you usually do, or sleeping far less than you usually do, or you find yourself sleeping in the middle of the day. You have these really major disruptive changes in your sleep. That's going to be an indication that your stress has risen to the level of trauma. Your experience of what's happening has risen to the level of trauma. Another clue is isolating yourself. Now, we're all physical distancing, but a lot of psychologists are talking about, it's not social distancing, meaning it's not really social distancing. We need to be connected and socially engaged with one another. It's physical distancing that's important. And we need to have really strong social ties. If you find yourself ignoring calls, text messages, video chats with friends and family, and isolating away from people that you love, people that are important parts of your social network. If you find yourself ignoring it or isolating or coming down to just one, being by yourself. The other indication is that you no longer do the things that you enjoy. So if you love playing a video game, and it's, the highlight of your day is the hour that you get to spend playing this game, and then it no longer seems interesting to you. Or if, you have a favorite walk that you like to do through the park and you find you're no longer motivated, that is an indication that you have got, you're experiencing this a little bit more strongly than just stress. Things that you usually enjoy that no longer interest you, that's going to be an indication that this is trauma and not just stress. And then finally, I have this image of a person on a pendulum swinging back and forth. Severe changes in emotions. So changes in emotions meaning 1 second you're really, really angry, the next second you're in tears, the next second you're laughing so hard you can't catch your breath. Not just like a single burst, but that happening regularly throughout the day where you have these big swings in emotion. The other indication might be if you're normally a sunny or cheerful person and you find yourself fixating on the negative, and not just about COVID, but about everything, right? So not COVID related, or quarantine related, or anything related to do with the pandemic, but instead, if you find, you're talking about making dinner and you find you have negative reactions to all of that, that's an indication that this is trauma and not stress, right? This is not just stress. This is happening, it's something bigger that you need to address. Well, let's talk about the 2 ways that you are going to be reaching out and how we can reach out and how we can do something about this. So if you see one of these things, the obsessing, the trouble with sleep, the isolating or not doing the things that you enjoy, or the changes in your emotion, if you see any of these, here's what you need to do. So we're going to talk about what you can handle at home, where you can offset the behavior, things that you can do at home versus what you need professional help from. And it helps, I think, to think about the things we can do at home when we get sick versus the things that we need a doctor for. So if I get a cold, right, I can stay at home, I can sleep, I can drink a lot of fluids, I can take care of myself in that way. If I have a sinus infection that goes on and on and on, I need to go to the doctor to get the antibiotics to knock the sinus infection out of my body, right? These are very similar things. One is more severe than the other. So that's what we're going to be talking about. What is it you can treat at home if you recognize trauma? Here is our do-it-yourself. That's what I call it, the do-it-yourself track, right? Things that you can do by yourself to help mitigate the effects of trauma. So first, talk to your friend or family or someone who's already in your social network. Vent to them. Tell them about everything that you're saying. I heard a really good piece of advice from a therapist yesterday who was talking about having 2 minutes of venting time. So having a chair in your family where if someone's sitting in that chair, They get to talk for 2 minutes straight about what they're up to and what they're doing. Another thing, so having that venting time is going to be really, really valuable. Another thing that you could do is reach out and talk to your faith community leaders. So either, normally a faith community might have one person that's the leader, or they might have a committee or team of people who's sort of in charge of these things. Reach out and if you're part of a faith community, reach out and connect with your community leaders. And just, have them have virtual coffee with you, or go do a social distancing picnic, right? Where you're sitting outside and you've got lawn chairs that are a few, 6 feet apart. Another thing you might look into is online support groups. So there are a lot, and right now there are even more than we have had in the past. Online support groups where you can vent, you can share, you can do what you need to do. The National Association for Mental Illness, that's what I was mentioning before, there is a Greater Houston chapter, and they have a lot of online support groups. There are also mental health apps, right? So there's a variety of different apps that you can use to improve your mental health. So those are some of the do-it-yourself options. Now, if you want to have more professional help, maybe you don't have the energy or the will to sort of put together your own package to help yourself. You sort of have to have a lot of motivation, a lot of agency to be able to do that, to put some resources together. If you want to go to something that already exists, number one, finding a therapist offering virtual sessions is going to be really important. In my reading for this, one of the things I found is that what's important when you're looking for a therapist is not necessarily the degree that they have. They should be some form of credentialed therapist, but it's not the level of degree that they have that's important. It's how well you get along with that person. So you need to find someone that you get along with and that you trust, and that's the most influential factor towards success with a therapist, is finding someone you click with. So what I would suggest is finding, after you look at therapist, find 3 or 4 that you think might work. Start with the first one, and if you don't click with that person, move on to your next one. But have that backup plan so that if you don't click with the first one, you don't feel overwhelmed or stuck or like you don't know what to do next, right? Come up with backups before you even start the first one. And then the employee assistance programs at Houston Methodist have been expanded. We have, I think, up to 10 sessions with a psychologist that are available to us through our EAP. Highly recommend doing that. There is a Harris County COVID support line at 833-986-1919, which is a really great way of, calling, talking to a real person and letting that stress out. And then I would highly encourage you to look at our COVID page for Houston Methodist to find those resources that are available to us as staff. Remember there are several emails that come out from HR every day, and in them they list the very specific and concrete resources available to us. So my question for you when it's time to add into the chat box is, what are some of the do-it-yourself methods that you might employ if you recognize you're having one of those indications of trauma, right? What is one of the... Let me put it this way, so it's easier to talk about someone else than to talk about you. So I'm experiencing trauma. Which do-it-yourself method would you recommend to me, right? What would you recommend to me? I'm experiencing one of those symptoms we talked about: obsessing over the current situation, isolating, having trouble sleeping, or swinging, jumping back between emotions. Which of those would you recommend to me? I want to hear what you have to say in the chat box. All right, thanks.